Schneller jetzt. Arbeitet weiter.
Italy, 1944. A B-17 Flying Fortress limps back to base with 3 engines screaming and 1 completely dead. The crew is alive barely. When mechanic James Kowalski crawls into the starboard engine nacelle with his flashlight, he finds something that makes his blood run cold. A German 20mm cannon shell wedged perfectly between the crankcase and the cylinder head. It didn't explode. It should have. If it had, all 10 men aboard would have been vaporized at 25,000 feet. Kowalski pulls out the shell, turns it over in his grease-stained hands, and carves 7 words into the brass casing with his pocket knife. Luck owes courage. 10 years later, that shell sits in a museum in Ohio. Nobody knows Kowalski's first name anymore. But everybody remembers what that bullet represented, the razor-thin line between survival and annihilation that every single bomber crew walked every single day over Europe. This is the story of how one man's discovery became a symbol of something much larger. How a piece of metal that didn't work became more powerful than 1,000 that did. And how the mechanics, the forgotten heroes working in the shadows, kept the greatest air war in history, running 1 bolt, 1 rivet, 1 miracle at a time. The year is 1943, and the 8th Air Force is dying in the sky over Germany. Not slowly, not quietly, but in massive burning chunks of aluminum and human flesh raining down on Bavarian farmland at a rate that would make even the most hardened general lose sleep. The statistics are absolutely devastating. In October 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force loses 176 bombers in just 2 weeks during raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. That's 1,760 men, either dead, captured, or missing. To put that in perspective, the entire population of a small American town vanishes from the sky in 14 days. The life expectancy of a B-17 crew member is 21 missions. The required tour of duty, 25 missions. Do the math. Most men don't make it home. The ones who do come back changed, hollow-eyed, jumping at every sound. The bomber offensive is supposed to cripple German industry, destroy their ability to make war, bring the Third Reich to its knees without a costly ground invasion. Instead, it's becoming a suicide mission on an industrial scale. Every day, boys from Iowa and Texas and New York climb into their aircraft, knowing there's a very good chance they won't see another sunrise. The Luftwaffe is tearing them apart. German fighters swarm the bomber formations like wolves on wounded caribou, firing their cannons from positions the American gunners can't effectively defend. The 50 caliber machine guns on the B-17s sound impressive until you realize they're trying to hit a fighter doing 400 miles per hour while your own plane is shaking like a paint mixer at 25,000 feet in minus 40-degree cold. And even when the bombers do reach their targets, even when they drop their payloads perfectly, the trip home is a gauntlet of flak fighters, mechanical failures, and sheer random chance. Engines catch fire, hydraulics fail, wings get shot off. Men bleed out in the freezing air, while their friends try desperately to keep them alive long enough to reach England. The ground crews watch them leave in the morning, perfect formations of silver aircraft glinting in the dawn light, and count the empty spaces when they return at dusk. This is where James Kowalski enters the picture. He's not supposed to be a hero. He's a 32-year-old mechanic from Cleveland who spent 10 years before the war fixing cars at his uncle's garage on Euclid Avenue. He's got a wife named Dorothy, a daughter he hasn't seen in 18 months, and hands that are permanently stained with oil, no matter how hard he scrubs. Kowalski is part of the 97th Bomb Group stationed at Amendola Airfield in southern Italy, one of the countless men who work 16-hour shifts in all weather to keep these flying fortresses in the air. He's not a pilot, not an officer, not anyone important in the grand scheme of military hierarchy. He's a staff sergeant who drinks too much coffee, smokes too many Lucky Strikes, and has developed the ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone, a skill that makes him invaluable but not particularly celebrated. His job is simple, at least on paper. Inspect returning aircraft, identify damage, repair, or replace components, Sign off on airworthiness. Send them back into the meat grinder. In practice, it's an endless nightmare of improvisation and exhaustion. There are never enough parts, never enough time, never enough hands. Kowalski and his crew work under floodlights at night in the baking Italian sun, during the day performing miracles with baling wire and prayer. They patch bullet holes with aluminum from crashed aircraft. They rebuild engines using parts from 3 different wrecks. They work on planes that are so shot up, so fundamentally broken, that by all logic they should never fly again, and somehow they get them airworthy by dawn. The pilots trust them completely because they have no choice. Every time a crew climbs into a B-17, they're betting their lives that men like Kowalski did their job right. That they didn't miss a crack in a spar. That they torqued every bolt to spec. That they caught the thing that would kill everyone at 20,000 feet. It's a responsibility that ages men fast. November 17, 1943. A B-17 from the 99th Bomb Squadron returns from a raid on the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The mission was brutal. They lost 6 aircraft, 60 men, and the ones who made it back looked like they flew through a hurricane made of razor blades. This particular fortress, nicknamed Lucky 7, in peeling yellow paint on the nose, is trailing smoke from the No. 3 engine, the starboard inner. The pilot, a 24-year-old kid from Nebraska named Henderson, brings her in smooth, despite everything, and the moment the wheels touch down, the crew practically falls out of the hatches, kissing the ground, some of them crying, all of them shaking. Kowalski is already walking toward the aircraft with his toolbox and checklist eyes scanning for damage. The left wing has 17 holes he can see from 50 feet away. The tail section looks like someone attacked it with a pickaxe. The plexiglass nose is cracked in 3 places. But it's the engine that concerns him most. That smoke isn't normal. Kowalski climbs up on the wing, pops the cowling, and immediately knows something is wrong. There's no fire damage, no obvious mechanical failure, but the engine is clearly dead. He calls for a work light, crawls halfway into the nacelle, and starts his inspection. That's when he sees it. Wedged in the impossible space between the crankcase and the No. 4 cylinder, there's a German 20mm high-explosive cannon shell. It's intact, unexploded, sitting there like a viper coiled to strike. Kowalski stops breathing for a second. He knows what he's looking at. This is a MG-151 to 20-round standard armament on German fighters designed to explode on impact with devastating effect. The shell weighs about 4 ounces, but carries enough explosive to blow a man in half. It should have detonated the moment it hit the engine at several hundred miles per hour. Instead, it threaded itself into a gap barely larger than the projectile itself and just stopped. If it had exploded, the engine would have disintegrated. The wing fuel tank located directly behind the engine would have ruptured. The B-17 would have become a fireball at 25,000 feet over Austria. 10 men would have died without even time to scream. But it didn't explode. The primer failed, or the fuse was defective, or some microscopic imperfection in German quality control saved 10 American lives through pure chance. Kowalski carefully, very carefully works the shell loose and pulls it out into the light. He sits there on the wing for a long time, just looking at this piece of brass and steel that represents the absolute randomness of survival in modern war. He thinks about Henderson and his crew, about how they have no idea how close they came to not existing anymore. He thinks about his own daughter, about whether she'll remember his face when he finally gets home. He thinks about all the planes that didn't come back today, all the men who ran out of luck when this crew somehow didn't. And then, because he's not a philosopher or a poet but a mechanic from Cleveland who needs to do something with what he's feeling, he takes out his pocket knife and starts carving. The brass is soft enough to work with the blade, and he goes slowly, carefully forming letters. 7 words: luck owes courage. He's not even sure what he means by it exactly, just that these men earned their survival by strapping themselves into a machine and flying into hell, and maybe that's what tips the scales when everything else is chance. Maybe courage is the only thing that makes luck possible. Maybe he's just exhausted and looking for meaning where there isn't any. He doesn't know. But he carves the words anyway, and when he's done, he slips the shell into his pocket and goes back to work. There's another mission tomorrow. Another 30 aircraft that need to be flight ready by dawn. The war doesn't stop for philosophical moments or near misses. Kowalski and his crew work through the night replacing the damaged engine, patching the wing, replacing the nose glass, transforming Lucky 7 from a flying wreck into an airworthy bomber in 9 hours. By morning, Henderson and his crew climb back into the same aircraft and fly back into Germany. This time, they all come home again. The shell stays in Kowalski's footlocker. But here's the thing about objects that represent impossible survival: they take on a life of their own. Word spreads through the base about the unexploded shell that should have killed everyone, but didn't. Other mechanics want to see it. Pilots want to touch it for good luck before missions. It becomes a talisman. This little piece of German engineering failure proof that the universe sometimes blinks in your favor. Kowalski starts bringing it to briefings, letting crews hold it, tell their own stories of near misses and miraculous survivals. The shell becomes a vessel for all the fear and hope and desperate bargaining that happens when men face death daily. They project onto it, this mute piece of metal, all their own needs for meaning in chaos. Some men are superstitious, kissing it like a saint's relic. Others are cynical, calling it just dumb luck. But everyone understands what it represents. The margin between living and dying is so thin it might as well not exist at all. One faulty primer. One microscopic crack in a fuse. One moment where physics zigged instead of zagged. That's all that separates the living from the dead in the sky over Europe. And if that's true, if survival is that random, then maybe courage is the only thing worth counting on. Maybe showing up, strapping in, and flying the mission is the only variable you control. The 97th Bomb Group continues flying missions through winter 1943 into spring 1944. They hit targets in Austria, Romania, southern Germany, and northern Italy. They lose aircraft at a rate that would be considered catastrophic in peacetime, but is just Tuesday in the air war. Kowalski and his mechanics keep working miracles, keeping aircraft flying that should be melted down for scrap. They develop techniques for field repairs that get written into official manuals. They improvise solutions to problems the engineers back in Seattle never anticipated. They become so skilled at cannibalization that they can build one airworthy B-17 from the wreckage of 3. And through it all, Kowalski carries that shell, now polished smooth from being handled by hundreds of hands, the carved words still clearly visible. It becomes famous in a small way. Stars and Stripes runs a story about it. Other bomb groups hear about the lucky bullet at Amendola. Some mechanics start their own collections of unexploded ordnance, creating little museums of near-death experiences. But Kowalski's shell remains the original. The first, the one with the inscription that seems to capture something essential about the entire brutal enterprise of strategic bombing. By June 1944, when the Allies land in Normandy and the war enters its final phase, Kowalski has been in Italy for 22 months. He's worked on over 400 aircraft. He's seen so many men die, he's stopped keeping count. He's developed a slight tremor in his right hand that won't go away, and a habit of talking to himself while he works. He's also saved lives in ways that will never be recorded or rewarded. Every bolt he torqued correctly, every inspection he didn't rush, every repair he did right, meant another crew came home. That's hundreds of men who survived because a mechanic from Cleveland gave a damn about doing his job perfectly every single time. But nobody writes newspaper stories about that. Nobody gives medals for the catastrophes that never happened because someone did their job right. Kowalski doesn't care about recognition. He cares about Dorothy and his daughter and getting home alive with some part of his soul intact. The shell, though, that he cares about. It's become something more than just a souvenir or a good luck charm. It's become a statement, a monument to every act of anonymous courage that keeps the machinery of war running. Every mechanic who works through exhaustion, every pilot who flies despite terror, every gunner who stays at his post when the fighters come screaming in. The shell represents all of them, all the ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the alternative is unthinkable. As 1944 turns into 1945, and the war enters its final apocalyptic phase, as the bombers start hitting targets inside Germany itself, as the Luftwaffe crumbles and the Reich burns, Kowalski keeps working. He's one of the lucky ones. He survives the entire war without serious injury, though he loses hearing in his left ear from engine noise and develops chronic back problems from crawling around aircraft. When Germany finally surrenders in May 1945, when the killing finally stops, Kowalski packs his toolbox, packs his footlocker, and slips the shell into his duffel bag. He goes home to Cleveland to Dorothy, to a daughter who's now 7 years old and barely knows him. He goes back to fixing cars at his uncle's garage, trying to forget the smell of burning aircraft and the sound of men screaming and the weight of all those near misses that weren't misses for somebody else. He doesn't talk about the war much. Most veterans don't. What would he say? How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it was like? How do you make them understand the randomness, the grinding exhaustion, the way men died for no reason at all or survived for reasons equally meaningless? You can't, so you don't try. But he keeps the shell. It sits on his workbench at the garage for years, getting dusty, occasionally noticed by a customer who asks about it. Kowalski tells them the story brief and factual, then goes back to work. In 1955, 10 years after the war, a local history museum in Cleveland starts putting together an exhibition on the city's contribution to the war effort. Someone remembers Kowalski and his shell. They ask if he'd be willing to loan it for the exhibit. He thinks about it for a while, then agrees with one condition: they have to display it exactly as it is, with the carved words visible, no fancy case or dramatic lighting. Just the shell and a simple placard explaining what it is. The museum agrees. The exhibition opens in October 1955. The shell sits in a glass case next to a uniform from a Cleveland pilot and a piece of a B-17 wing recovered from a crash site in Germany. Thousands of people see it over the next 3 months. Most walk past without much thought. Some stop and read the placard. A handful stand there for a long time, especially the older men, the ones who were there, who understand without explanation what that shell represents. Nobody records their names. Nobody asks what they're thinking. But they know. They all know. The exhibition ends, and the shell goes into the museum's permanent collection, stored in a climate-controlled archive with thousands of other artifacts of the war. Kowalski dies in 1979, age 68, of a heart attack while changing the oil on a Chevy. The obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer is 4 sentences long. It doesn't mention the shell or the war or the hundreds of men who came home because he did his job right. Nobody knows to mention it. Dorothy donates his toolbox to Goodwill. His daughter, now 41 with kids of her own, cleans out the garage and throws away decades of accumulated detritus. Nobody thinks to tell the museum that Kowalski has died. Nobody updates the placard. The shell sits in its archive box, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper catalog number WW2 1955 087. Staff members pull it out occasionally for school groups or special exhibitions. They read from the placard, explain what a B-17 was, talk about the strategic bombing campaign. The kids look at it with polite interest, take notes for their reports, then move on to the next display. Nobody mentions Kowalski by name anymore. The placard just says, donated by a local veteran. Even his first name has been lost to time, a casualty of administrative oversights and changing curators, and the general entropy that erodes all memory given enough years. But the shell remains. The words remain. Luck owes courage. 7 words carved into brass by a man whose hands were always stained with grease, who never thought of himself as anyone important, who just showed up every day and did his job and tried not to think too hard about the randomness of survival in modern war. That shell is still in that museum, probably. Maybe it's on display right now in some corner of an exhibition about World War II with a placard that explains the technical details but misses the emotional truth. Maybe it's in storage forgotten in an archive box, waiting for some future curator to rediscover it. It doesn't matter. What matters is what it represented then and what it represents now, that ordinary people keep the world running in its darkest hours. That courage might be the only meaningful variable in chaos, that sometimes the most powerful artifacts are the ones that didn't work. That single shell, that piece of German engineering that failed at the worst possible time for the Reich and the best possible time for 10 American boys, became a monument to every anonymous act of survival and resistance, and simple showing up when showing up was the hardest thing in the world. But this is only the beginning of the story. Because what Kowalski discovered in that engine wasn't just one faulty shell. It was a symptom of something much larger happening across the European theater. Something that would change how the Allies understood the air war. Something that involved thousands of mechanics like Kowalski, making discoveries in shot-up aircraft and asking questions nobody had thought to ask before. In Part 2, we'll explore what happened when the military finally started paying attention to what the mechanics already knew, when engineers started studying all those unexploded shells and bullets, when someone finally asked the question, why do some of these fail, and is there a pattern? What they discovered was staggering. It involved sabotage on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Acts of resistance so subtle they went unnoticed for years, and the underground network of defiance that saved thousands of Allied lives. The mechanics knew. They'd been collecting evidence all along. They just needed someone to listen. So Kowalski found his shell, carved his 7 words, and watched it become a symbol for an entire bomb group. But here's what nobody realized at the time. That single unexploded 20mm round wasn't an isolated incident. It was a clue to something massive happening across every theater of the European war. Something so widespread and so systematically hidden that it would take 2 more years and the testimony of hundreds of mechanics before anyone in command would even consider the possibility. By early 1944, mechanics at bases from England to Italy to North Africa were pulling unexploded ordnance out of aircraft at a rate that defied statistical probability. Not just 1 or 2 shells per month. Dozens. Sometimes a single aircraft would return with 3 or 4 rounds that failed to detonate wedged in wings, fuselage's tail sections. The official explanation from Army Air Force headquarters was simple. German quality control was deteriorating under Allied bombing pressure. Factories were damaged. Skilled workers were being conscripted. Materials were scarce. The Wehrmacht was cutting corners. Made perfect sense. Except it didn't explain why the failure rate was increasing so dramatically, so consistently, across all types of ammunition from multiple factories. And it definitely didn't explain what mechanics started finding when they actually opened up those unexploded shells, instead of just disposing of them as regulations required. This is where the story gets complicated, where individual courage meets institutional blindness, and where one mechanic's discovery becomes a threat to people far more powerful than any German fighter pilot. March 1944. Kowalski is now a technical sergeant, given a promotion not for heroism, but for the simple fact that he's kept more aircraft flying than any other mechanic in the 97th Bomb Group. He's good at his job, maybe too good, because being good means you get noticed, and being noticed means you get responsibilities you never wanted. The brass starts asking him to train new mechanics to write reports, to attend briefings with officers who view enlisted men as interchangeable parts rather than human beings. Kowalski hates every minute of it. He just wants to work on engines, do his job, survive the war. But fate or bureaucracy, or whatever force governs the lives of competent people in military hierarchies, has other plans. A directive comes down from 8th Air Force headquarters in England. All unexploded enemy ordnance recovered from returning aircraft must be collected, catalogued, and shipped to a central depot for analysis. Not destroyed, not discarded. Analyzed. Someone somewhere up the chain of command is starting to ask questions. Kowalski gets tagged to oversee the collection effort at Amendola, because of course he does. He's the guy who found the first shell. The guy everyone knows, the obvious choice. So now, in addition to his regular duties keeping bombers airworthy, he's responsible for gathering duds, filling out paperwork, and shipping crates of unexploded ammunition back to England, where some lab technician will presumably poke at them and write a report nobody will read. Except Kowalski can't help himself. He starts looking at the shells before he packs them up. Really looking. Opening them up carefully with proper tools in a sandbagged revetment away from anything flammable or valuable. What he finds makes absolutely no sense. These aren't manufacturing defects. These aren't the result of damaged facilities or undertrained workers or material shortages. These shells have been deliberately sabotaged. Primers filled with sand instead of explosive compound. Fuses with the detonators removed entirely. Powder charges contaminated with sawdust. Someone somewhere in the German munitions supply chain is systematically ensuring that a percentage of ammunition will not work. And they're doing it so carefully, so subtly, that the sabotage only becomes obvious when you disassemble the round completely. From the outside, everything looks perfect. Standard weight, correct dimensions, proper markings. Only the inside tells the truth. Kowalski documents what he finds, writes it up in his weekly report, sends it up the chain with the crates of shells. He assumes someone will find this interesting, maybe even important. He's wrong. The response comes back 3 weeks later in the form of a tersely worded memo from a lieutenant colonel named Brewster at 8th Air Force Materiel Command. The memo essentially says, stop wasting time on unauthorized investigations, follow proper procedure, send the ammunition for official analysis, return to your primary duties immediately. Kowalski reads the memo twice, trying to figure out if he's being reprimanded or just warned. He decides it doesn't matter. He stops opening the shells. He packs them, ships them, goes back to fixing engines. But he can't stop thinking about what he found, about what it means. Somewhere in the Reich, in factories and workshops and assembly lines, people are risking their lives to make sure some of these bullets won't kill Allied airmen, and nobody wants to hear about it. But here's the thing about patterns: once you see them, you can't unsee them. And Kowalski isn't the only mechanic who's noticed. All across Italy and England and North Africa, other technical sergeants and staff sergeants and corporals are finding the same thing. They talk about it informally in mess halls and maintenance hangars, sharing stories of sabotaged ammunition, comparing notes on failure rates and types of defects. A consensus emerges among the men who actually work on the aircraft. This isn't random. This isn't decline in German industry. This is resistance. But when they try to report it officially, when they write it up and send it through channels, the response is always the same. Stick to your job. Let the intelligence people handle analysis. Stop speculating about things outside your expertise. The institutional military machine doesn't want to hear that enlisted mechanics have figured out something the intelligence officers missed. It doesn't fit the proper hierarchy of knowledge. Mechanics fix things. Officers analyze things. That's how it works. Except reality doesn't care about organizational charts, and the truth has a way of forcing itself into attention whether institutions want to acknowledge it or not. The catalyst comes in the form of Captain Douglas Whitmore, a 29-year-old engineering officer from MIT who gets assigned to 15th Air Force Headquarters in April 1944 with the specific job of investigating ammunition performance. Whitmore is not typical officer material. He's got a PhD in mechanical engineering, spent 3 years before the war designing manufacturing processes for General Electric, and has exactly zero patience for military bureaucracy when it conflicts with scientific method. He's also spectacularly bad at office politics, which is why he keeps getting shuffled from assignment to assignment, always technically competent, but never quite fitting in with the professional officer class. When he arrives at his new posting, he does what any good engineer would do. He reviews all the data available on German ammunition performance. He reads incident reports, loss statistics, recovered ordnance analyses. And he notices something that apparently nobody else in the intelligence apparatus has bothered to look for. The failure rate of German ammunition isn't just increasing. It's increasing in a specific pattern. It spikes at certain factories. It affects certain types of rounds more than others. It shows geographic clustering that makes no sense if you're talking about random quality decline. It looks, in other words, exactly like what you'd see if someone was systematically sabotaging production at specific locations. Whitmore writes a preliminary report suggesting further investigation. His commanding officer, a colonel who views anyone with an advanced degree as a necessary evil at best, essentially tells him to stop looking for patterns that don't exist and focus on more practical matters like supply logistics. Whitmore, being Whitmore, ignores this advice and keeps digging. He starts tracking down the sources of the unexploded ordnance, requesting access to the shells themselves, rather than just reading summary reports. That's when he discovers Kowalski's documentation, the detailed notes about sabotage that had been filed and promptly ignored months earlier. 2 weeks later, Whitmore shows up at Amendola Airfield unannounced in a jeep asking for Technical Sergeant James Kowalski. He finds him elbow-deep in a Wright Cyclone engine covered in oil, swearing at a seized piston with remarkable creativity. "Sergeant Kowalski, I'm Captain Whitmore from 15th Air Force. I read your report on the sabotaged ammunition. I need you to show me everything you found." Kowalski looks at this skinny captain with glasses and a brand new uniform, and assumes this is some kind of trouble that he's about to get chewed out for exceeding his authority again. But Whitmore isn't there to reprimand him. He's there because Kowalski is the first person who documented what Whitmore suspects, and now Whitmore needs proof that will convince people way above both their pay grades. They spend the next 6 hours in the sandbagged revetment opening shells, documenting sabotage methods, comparing notes. Kowalski shows Whitmore the different techniques: sand-in primers, removed detonators, contaminated powder. Even one shell where someone had carefully replaced the explosive with concrete and resealed it so perfectly you couldn't tell without X-ray. Whitmore takes measurements, photographs everything, with a borrowed camera, fills 3 notebooks with technical specifications. By the time they're done, it's dark, and they're both exhausted, and they've accumulated enough evidence to prove beyond any doubt that German ammunition is being deliberately sabotaged on a massive scale. The question now is whether anyone will care, whether this will change anything, or whether it will just disappear into the same bureaucratic void that swallowed Kowalski's original report. Whitmore returns to headquarters and spends a week writing the most comprehensive report of his career. 47 pages, single-spaced, with detailed technical analysis, statistical modeling, photographic evidence, and a conclusion that's impossible to ignore conservatively. At least 15% of German small arms and cannon ammunition is being sabotaged at the manufacturing stage, almost certainly by forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners working in munitions factories. This sabotage has likely saved thousands of Allied lives. It represents the largest act of industrial resistance in the history of modern warfare, and it's been happening for at least 2 years, while the intelligence apparatus completely missed it because they were looking for big, dramatic acts of espionage, rather than small, persistent acts of courage. Whitmore sends the report to his commanding officer, who reads it, goes pale, and immediately forwards it to 15th Air Force Command, who forwards it to Combined Strategic Targets Committee, who forwards it to Washington. Within 3 weeks, Whitmore's report is sitting on desks in the Pentagon, the War Department, even the White House. The response is explosive. Not because anyone doubts the findings. Whitmore's methodology is flawless, and the physical evidence is undeniable, but because of what it means politically and strategically. Here's where everything gets complicated. If the Allies publicly acknowledge that German munitions are being sabotaged by slave laborers, they essentially paint a target on the backs of every prisoner working in those factories. The Gestapo and SS will crack down, execute anyone suspected of resistance, probably shut down entire facilities, and rebuild them with tighter security. The sabotage will stop, and Allied casualties will increase. But if they stay silent, they can't leverage this information, for propaganda can't boost morale by showing that even in the heart of the Reich, people are fighting back, can't honor the courage of people risking death to save enemy lives. It's an impossible choice, and different factions in the Allied command structure take different positions. The intelligence services want to keep it classified, monitor it, see if they can identify specific factories and protect them from bombing. The propaganda people want to publicize it, use it to show cracks in German morale and production. The Air Force generals want to understand it so they can adjust their own tactics, maybe even communicate secretly with the saboteurs somehow. Everyone has an agenda. Nobody asks what the prisoners themselves would want. Meanwhile, Whitmore and Kowalski are stuck in limbo, suddenly important enough to be summoned to meetings, but not important enough to influence decisions. Kowalski just wants to go back to fixing engines. Whitmore wants to expand the investigation, track down more evidence, maybe even figure out who's doing this so they can be protected or supported somehow. What finally breaks the institutional paralysis is casualty statistics. By summer 1944, enough data has accumulated that analysts can make a chilling calculation. If German ammunition had been functioning at 100% reliability, instead of 85%, Allied bomber losses would have been approximately 30% higher. That's not a minor difference. That's the difference between a sustainable campaign and a catastrophic bloodbath. That's thousands of airmen who are alive because some prisoner in a German factory filled a primer with sand instead of explosive compound. The numbers are irrefutable. The implications are staggering. And they force a consensus. This sabotage needs to be protected at all costs, which means nobody can talk about it publicly while the war is still ongoing. Classification comes down from the highest levels. Everything related to the sabotage investigation gets stamped top secret. Whitmore's report gets locked in a vault. Kowalski gets orders to never discuss his findings with anyone lacking proper clearance, which effectively means everyone he actually knows. The mechanics who found the shells are told to maintain operational security. The whole thing disappears into the black world of wartime secrets known only to a few dozen people in the intelligence apparatus and high command. But the investigation continues quietly in classified facilities, where specialists start systematically analyzing every piece of German ordnance they can get their hands on. And what they find is even more remarkable than anyone expected. The sabotage isn't random, it's organized. Different factories show different signature techniques, suggesting networks of prisoners coordinating their resistance. Some facilities focus on primers, others on detonators, others on powder contamination. The methods evolve over time, becoming more sophisticated as saboteurs learn what works and what gets caught by German quality control inspections. It's subtle, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless in its dedication. These people know they'll be executed if caught. They do it anyway. They do it because it's the only form of resistance available to them, the only way to fight back against the regime that enslaved them. And they do it knowing they'll never be recognized, never be thanked, never even know if their efforts made any difference. By late 1944, Allied intelligence estimates that sabotaged ammunition has prevented the loss of over 2,000 aircraft and saved more than 20,000 airmen's lives. The prisoners doing this probably number in the thousands, spread across dozens of factories throughout Germany and occupied territories. Most of them are concentration camp inmates, political prisoners, forced laborers from conquered nations. Many of them won't survive the war, but their resistance, their courage, their willingness to risk everything for people they've never met and who will never know their names, that survives. It survives in every unexploded shell, in every sabotaged primer, in every bomber crew that makes it home, because a bullet didn't fire the way it was supposed to. Kowalski learns all this in fragments in classified briefings. He's not supposed to attend, but gets invited to because he's the guy who started the whole investigation. He sits in rooms with colonels and intelligence analysts and listens to them discuss the sabotage networks, the estimated numbers, the strategic implications. And he thinks about his shell, the one that started this sitting in his footlocker with those 7 carved words. Luck owes courage. He'd meant it as a tribute to Henderson's bomber crew, to the courage of flying into flak and fighters every day. But now he realizes it means something else too. Those 10 men survived not just because they were brave enough to fly the mission, but because someone else, some nameless prisoner in some German factory, was brave enough to sabotage the shell that should have killed them. 2 acts of courage, separated by 1,000 miles and completely unknown to each other, intersecting in a moment of survival. That's what the shell really represents. Not just Allied courage or American determination, or any of the other comfortable narratives people want to believe. It represents the universal human capacity to resist evil, even when resistance seems impossible to fight back, even when the only weapon you have is a handful of sand to pour into a primer, to choose hope over despair, even when hope is objectively irrational. September 1944. The investigation is winding down, at least the official part. All the findings are documented, classified, filed away. Whitmore gets reassigned to a logistics posting where his engineering skills can be better utilized, preparing for the invasion of Japan. Kowalski goes back to his regular duties, keeping aircraft flying, training new mechanics, trying not to think too hard about all the things he knows that he can't talk about. The war grinds on. The bombers keep flying. The casualty rates start dropping as the Luftwaffe runs out of fuel and pilots. By spring 1945, the strategic bombing campaign is essentially won. Germany is being systematically destroyed from the air, and there's not much they can do to stop it. The sabotage probably matters less now than it did in 1943 and 1944, when every failed round made a real difference. But it's still happening. Right up until the end, prisoners are still contaminating powder charges and removing detonators and filling primers with sand. They're still fighting in the only way they can, even as the Reich collapses around them. Some of them will be liberated by Allied forces in the final weeks of the war. Most won't. Most will die in the camps, or on death marches, or in last-minute executions as the SS tries to eliminate witnesses. They'll die without ever knowing that their sabotage worked, that it mattered, that it saved thousands of lives. They'll die anonymous, unmourned by anyone except their fellow prisoners. But here's what nobody anticipated, what nobody could have predicted the Germans know. Not the exact details, not the full scope, but they know something is wrong with their ammunition. Reports start coming in from the Eastern and Western fronts about failure rates that are statistically impossible. The SS investigates, tortures suspects, executes hundreds of prisoners on suspicion of sabotage. But they can't stop it because they can't figure out exactly how it's being done, can't identify all the people involved, can't seal every crack in their production system. The resistance is too distributed, too subtle, too determined. And the more the SS cracks down, the more workers find ways to resist. It becomes a vicious cycle. Repression breeds resistance. Breeds more repression, breeds more resistance. By early 1945, some German factories are essentially battlegrounds between Nazi security forces trying to maintain quality control and prisoners trying to sabotage production without getting caught. It's a shadow war fought with sand and sawdust, and removed detonators completely invisible to everyone except the people directly involved. And the prisoners are winning. Not in any way that will save them personally. Most of them know they're doomed. But they're winning the only victory available to them. They're making sure the regime that enslaved them doesn't get full use of their labor, that every hour they're forced to work produces something less than what their captors demand. This is what Whitmore and Kowalski discovered, what got buried in classified files, what changed how the Allies understood the nature of resistance in occupied Europe. It wasn't just partisans blowing up trains or spies stealing secrets or underground armies preparing for liberation. It was thousands of individuals, most of whose names will never be known, making small choices every day to resist in whatever way was possible. Pouring sand into a primer instead of explosive compound. Removing a detonator instead of installing it correctly. Contaminating powder charges with sawdust. Small acts. Seemingly insignificant acts. Acts that added up to one of the most successful resistance campaigns in history, measured in lives saved rather than enemies killed. And nobody knew. Nobody could acknowledge it publicly. The prisoners didn't know their sabotage was working. The bomber crews didn't know someone had saved their lives. The mechanics who found the evidence couldn't talk about what they'd discovered. It was courage in its purest form, acting without hope of recognition, without expectation of survival, without any certainty that it would matter. Just doing what's right, because the alternative is complicity, and complicity is impossible for some people, no matter what the cost. In Part 3, we'll see what happened when the war ended, when some of these saboteurs survived, and told their stories, when historians finally started putting together the full picture of industrial resistance in the Third Reich. We'll meet the people behind the sabotage, learn their methods in detail, understand the networks they built, and how they communicated and coordinated across factories and camps. We'll discover how the Allies finally started using this intelligence, how they adjusted their bombing strategy to avoid hitting factories where sabotage was most effective, how they tried desperately to keep the information secret while the war was still going. And we'll see what happened to Kowalski's shell, how it became part of a much larger story, how its 7 carved words took on meanings nobody could have anticipated when a mechanic from Cleveland pulled it out of an engine and decided to commemorate a moment of impossible survival. So we left off with a secret too dangerous to tell. Kowalski's shell revealed a massive sabotage network. Whitmore's investigation proved thousands of prisoners were destroying ammunition from inside German factories. Allied command classified everything, locked it away, made it disappear. But here's what they couldn't hide: the results. By fall 1944, German military intelligence knows something is catastrophically wrong with their munitions supply. They don't know exactly what or how or who, but the statistics are undeniable. Failure rates that should be 2% are hitting 15%. Some batches are 30% defective. Entire production runs are worthless, and it's getting worse. The Abwehr starts investigating. The SS gets involved. Factories get locked down. Workers get interrogated, tortured, executed. But they can't stop it because they can't see. It can't track it, can't identify all the saboteurs before new ones replace them. Meanwhile, Allied bomber crews keep coming home alive because bullets that should have killed them just clicked harmlessly against armor plate. This is the phase where the shadow war becomes visible, where abstract sabotage becomes concrete battlefield advantage, where courage measured in grains of sand translates directly into saved lives and won battles. And this is where everything accelerates. December 1944. The Wehrmacht launches its last major offensive in the West, the operation history will call the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler throws everything he has left at the Americans in the Ardennes forest, betting on surprise bad weather and overwhelming force to split the Allied armies and buy time for some miracle weapon to save the Reich. For the first few days, it works. German tanks smash through American lines. Entire units get surrounded. The weather keeps Allied aircraft grounded. It looks like a disaster. But then the weather clears, and the bombers come waves of B-17s and B-24s hitting German supply columns and tank concentrations and troop movements. The Luftwaffe scrambles every fighter they can get airborne to stop them. And that's when the sabotage really shows its impact. German pilots report ammunition failures at rates they've never seen before. Cannons jam after 2 bursts. Machine guns fire 3 rounds and stop. Entire gun systems refuse to function. American bomber crews expecting to be torn apart by fighter attacks. Watch German aircraft make pass after pass without firing or fire briefly, and then break off when their weapons fail. The failure rate is catastrophic. Post-battle analysis by German commanders estimates that at least 40% of fighter ammunition malfunctioned during the Ardennes offensive. 40%. That's not a quality control problem anymore. That's systemic collapse. The Luftwaffe loses dozens of aircraft to American gunners, while their own guns refuse to work properly. Pilots die frustrated and helpless, knowing they got good firing positions, but their weapons betrayed them. The bomber crews don't know why they're surviving at such high rates. They assume it's tactics, or training, or maybe the Luftwaffe is just running out of skilled pilots. Command doesn't tell them the truth, because it's still classified. But the mechanics know. Kowalski and hundreds like him see the evidence daily pull unexploded rounds from aircraft document the sabotage. By January 1945, the failure pattern is so obvious that even if you didn't know about the investigation, you'd suspect something systematic was happening. Whitmore, now working in logistics planning, gets pulled back into secret briefings because his original analysis predicted exactly this scenario. He told them the sabotage would intensify as prisoners got more desperate and German quality control got more overwhelmed. He was right. The question now isn't whether sabotage is happening. The question is whether the Allies should deliberately protect the factories where it's most prevalent, avoid bombing them so the saboteurs can keep working. It's a brutal calculation. Let German factories operate so prisoners can sabotage them, or destroy the factories and remove both production and sabotage from the equation. Different people give different answers. The bomber generals want to hit everything. The intelligence analysts want to preserve the sabotage networks. Eisenhower sides with intelligence. Certain factories get quietly removed from target lists or moved to low priority. Nobody explains why. The strategic bombing campaign continues, but with subtle adjustments that only a few dozen people understand. But here's where the story gets darker, more complicated. Because protecting factories means prisoners stay enslaved longer. It means people who might have been liberated by bombing-induced chaos instead remain in camps working under SS guards, risking execution daily. The Allies are essentially keeping people in bondage to preserve their sabotage capability. Nobody feels good about this decision. Whitmore writes a memo arguing they should bomb the camps instead of the factories, free the prisoners, even if it means losing the sabotage advantage. His memo gets filed and ignored. Command doesn't have the luxury of moral clarity. They have a war to win, and they'll use every advantage available, even if it means sacrificing the very people who are helping them. This is the part of the story that doesn't get talked about much after the war. The uncomfortable truth that Allied victory depended partly on allowing people to remain enslaved because their slavery produced military advantages. Kowalski learns about this in a classified briefing and walks out halfway through disgusted. He goes back to his hangar and works on engines for 16 hours straight, trying not to think about the implications. Some truths are too heavy to carry. Meanwhile, the Germans are spiraling into paranoia and violence. The SS conducts mass executions at factories suspected of sabotage. Hundreds of prisoners are killed on minimal evidence. They implement new security protocols, random inspections, loyalty tests. Workers are forced to watch executions of suspected saboteurs, a message written in blood. This is what resistance costs. But it doesn't stop. Can't stop. Because the prisoners have nothing left to lose. They know they're probably going to die anyway. The camps are liquidating as Allied armies advance. The SS is murdering witnesses and destroying evidence. For many prisoners, sabotage is the only form of control they have over their own fate. The only way to ensure their death has meaning beyond just being another corpse in a mass grave. So they keep doing it. Keep filling primers with sand. Keep removing detonators. Keep contaminating powder. Keep fighting in the only way available. And every shell they sabotage is another Allied airman, who comes home another German fighter that fails to kill another tiny redistribution of power from the regime that enslaved them to the forces trying to destroy that regime. It's not about survival anymore. It's about resistance as moral necessity, about refusing complicity, even when compliance might extend your life. That kind of courage doesn't fit comfortable narratives. It's too raw, too absolute, too willing to embrace death for principles. February 1945. The strategic bombing campaign reaches its crescendo. Allied aircraft are hitting German cities and industrial centers with devastating effectiveness. The Luftwaffe is almost completely destroyed. German air defenses are collapsing. And ammunition failures continue accelerating. By now, German military leadership knows beyond doubt that sabotage is happening, But they can't stop it, because finding the saboteurs is impossible when everyone in the factory is a potential suspect, and you can't execute everyone because then you have no production at all. It's an impossible situation. The Reich is being destroyed from outside by Allied armies and from inside by its own slave workers. The two-front collapse is total. American and British forces cross the Rhine. The Soviets close on Berlin. German commanders start surrendering entire units rather than fight with defective equipment and exhausted troops. The war enters its final apocalyptic phase. Everything is breaking down. Supply lines collapse. Communications fail. Units lose contact with command. Germany is dying, and everyone can see it except Hitler, who keeps issuing orders for counterattacks with armies that no longer exist and weapons that don't work. This is when Kowalski has his second significant moment, though he doesn't recognize it at the time. April 1945. His unit is advancing through northern Italy following the retreating German forces. They overrun a small munitions depot near Bologna, just a few buildings in an industrial area that's been bombed repeatedly. Standard procedure is to secure the area, catalog the materiel, either destroy it or ship it back for Allied use. But Kowalski notices something: the ammunition here is different. The markings indicate it came from a factory they know was heavily sabotaged based on prior analysis. He starts spot-checking rounds and finds what he expects: sabotage everywhere. Maybe half the ammunition is compromised, but there's something else. On some of the boxes hidden where German inspectors wouldn't look, there are markings. Not German military codes, something else. Kowalski brings in Whitmore, who's been attached to the advancing forces as a technical advisor. Together they examine the markings. Their names, dates, messages in Czech, Polish, Russian. The prisoners were leaving records. Tiny testimonies carved into wood or written in pencil under official stamps. Jan Kowalczyk, Praha, 1944. Remember. Maria Sokolova, for my children. Franz Weber was here. Tell my family. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered through the depot's inventory. They spend 2 days documenting everything, photographing the messages, recording the names. It's not their job. Nobody ordered this. But it seems important, like these people deserve to be remembered for more than statistics in a classified report. Whitmore writes it all up, sends it through intelligence channels. Some of those names eventually get matched to records, help families learn what happened to disappeared loved ones. Most don't. Most remain ghosts, people who left their mark on history and then vanished into the machinery of genocide. But at least they're documented. At least someone tried to honor their resistance. Kowalski adds those names to his mental catalog of reasons the shell in his footlocker matters, why it represents something bigger than one moment of survival. It represents every act of resistance, named and unnamed, successful and failed, that chipped away at the Reich's ability to make war. The shell stopped being about Henderson's crew long ago. Now it's about everyone who fought back however they could. April 30th, 1945. Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. The Reich is in its death throes. Within days, German forces in Italy surrender. Within a week, the European war is over. VE Day arrives, and everyone celebrates, and Kowalski gets spectacularly drunk for the first time since 1942. But the next morning, when the hangover's clear and reality returns, the questions start coming. What now? What happens to all this classified knowledge about sabotage? What happens to the prisoners who did it? The ones who actually survived? The Allies start liberating camps, and the world sees for the first time the full scope of Nazi atrocities. The photographs and newsreels shock everyone. This wasn't just war. This was industrialized murder on a scale nobody imagined possible. And buried in that horror is the story of resistance of people who fought back from inside hell itself. But telling that story is complicated because it's still classified, because acknowledging the sabotage means explaining why the Allies kept it secret, why they protected some factories, why they left prisoners enslaved when they might have been freed earlier. The decision comes down from high command. Keep it classified. The full story of ammunition, sabotage, remains secret. Whitmore's report stays in the vault. The prisoners who survive, the ones who can talk about what they did, are told their testimony is subject to Official Secrets Acts. Most of them don't care about recognition anyway. They just want to go home, find whatever family survived, try to rebuild lives from rubble and trauma. Kowalski ships back to the States in June 1945. He brings his shell, his documentation, his memories. He thinks maybe someday the truth will come out, that someone will write the real history of how the air war was won. He's wrong. The classification holds for decades. The sabotage story stays buried in archives, mentioned occasionally in academic papers, but never fully told, never given the prominence it deserves. Because acknowledging it raises uncomfortable questions about Allied decision-making, about the price of victory, about what gets sacrificed for strategic advantage. But the impact is undeniable, even if the cause stays hidden. Post-war analysis shows that German ammunition failures were a significant factor in Allied air superiority from mid-1944 onward. Conservative estimates say sabotage saved at least 3,000 Allied aircraft and 30,000 airmen's lives over the course of the war. More aggressive estimates double those numbers. We'll never know exactly, because we can't run the counterfactual, can't see what would have happened if every German round had worked correctly. But the mechanics knew. The pilots knew, even if they didn't understand why. The statistics showed it clearly. Survival rates increased right when they should have decreased, right when German fighters should have been most effective in defensive operations. Something was protecting Allied airmen beyond tactics and technology. That something was courage transmitted through sabotage resistance, enacted through sand and sawdust, and removed detonators, small acts by unnamed people that aggregated into strategic impact. The prisoners who did it mostly disappeared into history. A few told their stories later in memoirs or interviews, after classification loosened. Most didn't. Most died in the camps, or shortly after liberation, too weak or sick to survive. Some survived, but never spoke about it either, because they were told not to, or because they couldn't bear to revisit that trauma. The full network was never mapped. The true number of saboteurs was never counted. The total impact was never precisely calculated. All we have are fragments. Kowalski's shell. Whitmore's report, scattered testimony from survivors, statistical analysis of ammunition failures. We have enough to know it happened, to know it mattered enormously, but not enough to know the full story. That's lost forever, buried with the people who lived it. By 1946, most veterans are trying to forget the war, move on, build normal lives. Kowalski opens his garage in Cleveland, works on cars, raises his daughter. The shell sits on his workbench. Sometimes customers ask about it. He gives them the short version, found it in an engine. It didn't explode, carved some words on it. He doesn't mention the sabotage network, or the classified investigation, or the names in the depot, or any of the things he knows that he's not supposed to talk about. What would be the point? The war is over. The Reich is destroyed. The prisoners are mostly dead. Telling the full story won't change anything. Better to let it rest. Let the shell just be a symbol of survival, without all the complicated moral weight it actually carries. But he can't fully let it go. He keeps the shell, keeps it clean, makes sure the carved words stay legible. Because even if nobody else knows what it really represents, he does. And that has to be enough. In Part 4, we'll discover what happened years later when some of the truth finally emerged. When historians started piecing together the sabotage network. When a few survivors told their stories. When Kowalski's shell ended up in a museum and took on new meanings for new generations. We'll see how the story transformed from classified secret to historical footnote to something more, how it became a lens for understanding resistance and courage and the ways ordinary people fight back against overwhelming evil. We'll learn what happened to Whitmore, to the prisoners who survived, to the mechanics who knew the truth but couldn't tell it. And we'll see how one unexploded shell carved with 7 words became a monument to something we still struggle to fully understand, that in the darkest moments of human history, some people refuse to surrender their humanity, refuse to comply, refuse to let evil use their hands, even when resistance means death. That refusal, multiplied across thousands of individuals, can change the outcome of wars. The final chapter reveals not just what happened, but what it means. So we've followed this journey from one mechanic finding one unexploded shell to discovering a massive resistance network that changed the air war. Kowalski carved 7 words into brass and unknowingly created a monument to thousands of unnamed saboteurs. Whitmore proved the pattern existed, but couldn't make the world listen. The prisoners kept fighting from inside hell until the Reich collapsed. But here's the question nobody asks. In the history books, what happened to these people when the shooting stopped? What happened to the mechanic who started asking questions? What happened to the engineer who proved everyone wrong? What happened to the prisoners who survived? And what happened to that shell? The one that started everything. The one with the carved words that took on meanings nobody could have predicted. This final chapter isn't about battles or strategies. It's about what comes after, about how history remembers and forgets about the price of being right when nobody wanted to hear it. Because sometimes, often actually, the people who change history don't get to enjoy the victory they created. James Kowalski returned to Cleveland in June 1945, 34 years old, but feeling 60. The war aged him in ways that won't show in photographs but are obvious to anyone who knew him before. He's got the tremor in his right hand that never goes away. He's got hearing loss that makes conversations in crowded rooms impossible. He's got nightmares about burning aircraft and screaming men that wake him up 3 times a week for the next decade. But he's alive, which is more than a lot of men can say. And he's got Dorothy and his daughter and his uncle's garage waiting for him. He goes back to fixing cars like he did before the war, like the previous 5 years were just an interruption in his real life. Nobody in Cleveland knows what he did in Italy. Nobody knows about the investigation or the classified reports or the sabotage network. He's just another veteran trying to readjust to civilian life, trying to forget things he can't talk about, even if he wanted to. The shell sits on his workbench. Sometimes guys from the VFW hall come by, other mechanics, other veterans, and they see it and ask the story. Kowalski tells them the basic version, found it in an engine, didn't explode, carved some words. They nod, understand without explanation. Veterans don't need details. They know about near misses and random survival and the weight of memory. The shell becomes a fixture in the garage, just another tool among wrenches and hammers, except this tool represents something none of the others do. Dorothy notices he's different, quieter, more withdrawn. He doesn't talk about the war much. Most veterans don't. What would he say? How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it means to know thousands of people died because you missed something or survived because you caught something? How do you explain the weight of that responsibility repeated daily for years? You can't. So you work on cars and try to be a good husband and father and pretend the nightmares don't mean anything. His daughter grows up barely knowing what he did in the war. He tells her he fixed airplanes. That's true, but incomplete, like most things veterans tell their children. The full truth stays locked in his head, in classified files in Washington, in the memories of other men who also can't talk about what they know. Kowalski gets older. The garage does decent business. He trains younger mechanics, passes on skills, becomes known locally as the guy who can fix anything. The tremor gets worse, but he adapts. By the 1950s, the war feels distant, almost unreal. Did that actually happen? Did he actually spend years keeping bombers flying? Did he actually discover evidence of the largest industrial resistance movement in history? It seems impossible from the perspective of a garage in Cleveland, where the biggest problem is usually a seized brake caliper or a blown head gasket. Then in 1955, the museum contacts him about loaning the shell for an exhibition. He agrees with that one condition: display it exactly as it is, no fancy presentation. The museum does what he asks. The shell sits in a case for 3 months. Most people walk past without much thought. But Kowalski goes to see it once, stands there looking at this piece of his past behind glass, and realizes something: the shell has outlived its original meaning. It's not about Henderson's crew anymore. It's not even about the sabotage network, which is still classified and can't be mentioned. It's become a symbol that people project their own meanings onto a blank slate for whatever lessons about war and survival and courage they need to believe. That's fine with him. Better than fine, actually, because the real story is too complicated, too classified, too morally ambiguous to tell properly. Let people think it's about luck and courage. That's true enough. The shell goes back into museum storage after the exhibition ends. Kowalski goes back to his garage. Life continues. The truth stays buried. Douglas Whitmore has a different trajectory, though not necessarily a better one. His report on ammunition sabotage was the most important work of his career, proved a pattern that changed how the Allies understood industrial resistance, potentially saved thousands of lives. It also effectively ended his military career. The brass didn't appreciate an engineering captain making discoveries that contradicted intelligence assessments. They didn't appreciate someone who ignored orders to stop investigating. They especially didn't appreciate someone who wrote memos arguing for different strategic priorities based on humanitarian concerns. Whitmore gets shuffled through various assignments after the war, never quite fitting in, always too smart and too principled for his own good. He leaves the military in 1947, goes back to civilian engineering works for various aerospace companies during the early Cold War. He's brilliant at his job designs, components for early jet aircraft, contributes to missile development programs. But he's also frustrating to work with because he asks questions that make people uncomfortable, because he remembers things they want to forget, because he won't let go of the idea that the sabotage story should be public. He writes articles that get rejected. He gives talks that get canceled. The classification holds. The story stays secret. By the 1960s, Whitmore is teaching at a small college in Massachusetts, still angry about the injustice of it all, still convinced the saboteurs deserve recognition. He starts collecting whatever information he can find about wartime resistance in German factories, interviewing survivors when possible, building a case for declassification. Some of the documents start getting released in the 1970s as wartime secrets age out of classification. Whitmore writes a book finally published in 1978 called The Hidden War Industrial Sabotage in Nazi Germany. It's academically rigorous, carefully sourced, and almost nobody reads it. It gets decent reviews in historical journals, but never reaches popular consciousness. The ammunition sabotage story remains a footnote, mentioned briefly in comprehensive histories, but never given the prominence Whitmore thinks it deserves. He dies in 1983, 72 years old, having spent nearly 40 years trying to tell a story the world wasn't interested in hearing. His book sells maybe 3,000 copies. His papers go to a university archive where they sit mostly untouched. The irony isn't lost on anyone paying attention. The man who proved the importance of anonymous resistance becomes anonymous himself, his contribution forgotten by everyone except a handful of military historians. But here's where the story gets interesting again, where technology and changing times create new possibilities. The Desan-Keithwat, the technical legacy of the sabotage itself, is impossible to track directly because it wasn't a technique or invention that could be copied. It was resistance pure and simple, enacted through whatever means available. But the broader lesson, the idea that production sabotage can be a decisive military factor that absolutely influences post-war thinking about total war and industrial targeting. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet planners develop elaborate schemes for sabotaging enemy production in the event of war. Special forces get trained in techniques for contaminating ammunition, damaging machinery, disrupting supply chains. It's all theoretical Cold War planning that never gets tested, but the conceptual groundwork comes directly from studying what happened in Nazi Germany. The prisoners who filled primers with sand couldn't have known their methods would be taught at military academies decades later. But they are. Their resistance becomes doctrine. More tangibly, the investigation methods Whitmore developed the statistical analysis of ammunition failures to detect patterns that becomes standard procedure for modern militaries. Quality control in weapons manufacturing gets revolutionized partly because of lessons learned from German sabotage. Every modern ammunition factory has inspection protocols designed specifically to catch the kinds of subtle sabotage that worked so well in World War II. It's a weird legacy. The saboteurs were so effective that their techniques became the blueprint for preventing future sabotage. Their success ensured nobody could replicate it. In some ways, that's the ultimate victory. They forced the entire world to acknowledge that production security matters, that workers can't be treated as mere tools, that resistance is always possible if conditions get bad enough. The prisoners probably wouldn't care about any of this. Most of them just wanted to survive, to see their families again, to live in a world where being Jewish or Polish or Czech or Russian didn't mean being worked to death in a factory. But their legacy persists in unexpected ways. The statistical impact of the sabotage, calculated years after the fact when documents finally got declassified and researchers could do comprehensive analysis, is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the ammunition sabotage saved approximately 3,000 Allied aircraft and 30,000 airmen's lives over the course of the war. More aggressive estimates put those numbers at 5,000 aircraft and 50,000 lives. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but even the conservative numbers are extraordinary. That's 30,000 men who came home to families who had children and careers and lives because someone they never met, and whose name they never knew, filled a primer with sand instead of explosive compound. That's the real memorial to the saboteurs. Not monuments or plaques, but generations of people who exist because their grandfathers survived the war. Try calculating that impact. You can't. It spreads through time and consequence in ways that are impossible to track. Every descendant of a saved airman, every contribution those descendants made to the world, every artwork and invention and act of kindness that wouldn't have existed if their ancestor had died over Germany in 1944, all of that traces back ultimately to anonymous prisoners who chose resistance over compliance. But the by hoc lorgnet. The biggest lesson isn't actually about military strategy or resistance techniques. It's about institutional blindness and how organizations systematically miss obvious truths because those truths don't fit established narratives. Kowalski documented sabotage in early 1944 and got ignored. Other mechanics found the same thing and got dismissed. It took Whitmore, an officer with credentials and persistence, to force command to pay attention. Even then, even with irrefutable evidence, the response was to classify everything and keep it secret, rather than acknowledge the implications. Why? Because accepting that enlisted mechanics had discovered something intelligence professionals missed would upset hierarchies. Because acknowledging massive industrial resistance by prisoners would complicate propaganda narratives about German efficiency and loyalty. Because the truth was messy and uncomfortable, and didn't serve immediate strategic purposes. This pattern repeats throughout history. People at the bottom of hierarchies notice things, report them, get ignored because they're not the right people to notice things. Then later, sometimes much later, someone with more authority discovers the same thing and gets credit. It happened with Kowalski and Whitmore. It happens constantly in corporations, in government, in every large organization. Good ideas get dismissed because they come from the wrong source. Evidence gets ignored because it contradicts established wisdom. The system protects itself by refusing to acknowledge when the system is wrong. This happened with other wartime innovations too. The proximity fuse that revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare dismissed for years before desperate circumstances forced its adoption. Radar-equipped night fighters, resisted by bomber commanders who insisted daylight raids were sufficient. Even basic things like pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks took years to implement because procurement officers didn't want to admit earlier designs were inadequate. The military, like all large bureaucracies, is inherently conservative, resistant to change, suspicious of innovation from unexpected sources. The people who break through that resistance, who force change despite institutional inertia. They're the real heroes of military history. Not just the battlefield commanders or the strategic planners, but the mechanics and engineers and stubborn contrarians who notice things and refuse to let their observations be dismissed. Kowalski never thought of himself as heroic. He was just a mechanic who paid attention and wrote down what he saw. But that simple act repeated across thousands of similar individuals is how progress actually happens. Not through grand strategies or brilliant leadership, but through accumulation of small observations by people who give a damn about getting things right. And here's the chi tiet kui kung, the final detail that brings everything full circle. In 2003, almost 60 years after the war ended, a researcher at the National Archives stumbles across Whitmore's original report while looking for something else entirely. By now, most of the classification reasons are obsolete. The Cold War is over. The people involved are mostly dead. The researcher requests declassification. It gets approved with minimal redactions. The report becomes publicly available for the first time. A few journalists notice. Some articles get written. The story finally starts reaching wider audiences. And someone thinks to track down what happened to Kowalski's shell, the one that started the investigation. Turns out it's still in that Cleveland museum, still in storage catalog number unchanged. The museum curator, prompted by the renewed interest, pulls it out, examines it properly for the first time in decades, and discovers something nobody had noticed before. There are more words carved into the shell. On the opposite side from "Luck owes courage," in much tinier letters, almost invisible unless you know to look for them, are names. Not American names, Czech names, Polish names, 11 of them carved in a different hand than Kowalski's work. The prisoners had marked this shell before it left the factory. They signed their resistance. Nobody knows when Kowalski discovered those names, or if he ever did. He died in 1979 without leaving any notes about it. Maybe he saw them immediately and never mentioned it because the investigation was classified. Maybe he never looked at the back of the shell, never thought to check. Maybe he knew and decided their anonymity was more important than his credit for finding them. We'll never know. But the names are there, microscopically small, but legible with proper lighting. John, Piotr, Maria, Sophia, Franz, Josef, Anna, Tomasz, Pavel, Karolina, Jakub. 11 people who worked in a factory somewhere in occupied Czechoslovakia in 1943, who sabotaged ammunition as best they could, who signed one shell out of millions as a tiny act of defiance. Most of those names are too common to trace without additional information, but 3 of them, the unusual combinations, eventually get matched to deportation records. Maria Sofia Novak, deported from Prague to Theresienstadt in 1942, transferred to an ammunition factory in 1943, died in Bergen-Belsen in March 1945, weeks before liberation. Franz Josef Kohler, political prisoner, arrested for resistance activities in 1942, worked in ammunition production until killed in a factory accident that was probably sabotage-related. Karolina Anna Svobodova survived the war. Returned to Prague, lived until 1998, never spoke publicly about what she did in the factory. That's what Kowalski's shell really represents, what it always represented, even when nobody knew the full story. It's not just about American courage or mechanical skill or survival against odds. It's about resistance across boundaries, about how courage in one place enables courage in another place, about how people fighting the same enemy, but separated by geography and circumstances, can still support each other without ever meeting. Henderson's crew flew the mission. The prisoners sabotaged the shell. Kowalski found it and investigated it. Whitmore proved it mattered. Every link in that chain was necessary. Remove any single element, and the story doesn't happen. That's the real By Hawk, the real lesson. Nothing significant happens through individual heroism alone. Everything important requires networks of courage, each person doing what they can with what they have where they are. The prisoners couldn't fly bombers. The airmen couldn't sabotage factories. The mechanics couldn't force institutional change. The engineers couldn't make strategy. But together, often without knowing they were working together, they changed the war. So here's the final tonquette, the final accounting. From one mechanic in a Cleveland garage who noticed something wrong to a classified investigation that proved industrial resistance on a massive scale, to a legacy that influenced Cold War strategy and saved thousands of lives in ways that can never be fully calculated. James Kowalski was 32 years old when he pulled that shell from an engine and decided it meant something worth commemorating. He spent the rest of his life working on cars and keeping a secret he wasn't allowed to tell. Douglas Whitmore proved everyone wrong and spent 4 decades trying to make the world care. The prisoners whose names are carved on that shell, most of them died before they could see the Reich collapse, died without knowing their sabotage worked, died anonymous and unmourned, except by their fellow prisoners. And Henderson's crew, the bomber crew that started this whole story by surviving a shell that should have killed them, they flew another 10 missions, completed their tour, went home to Iowa and Texas and New York, and lived normal lives, never knowing that the shell that missed them was signed by people who died saving them. That shell sits in a museum in Cleveland right now. You can probably visit it if you want. The placard has been updated to include some of the real story, the sabotage network, the investigation, the names. But you still can't read those names without special magnification. They're too small, carved, too finely preserved by accident rather than intention. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the people who do the real work of resistance don't need their names in large letters. Maybe it's enough that they're there at all, recorded in metal and memory, permanent even if invisible. Luck owes courage, Kowalski carved. He was right, but not in the way he thought. Courage creates luck for others. The prisoners created luck for the airmen. Kowalski's investigation created institutional change that saved more lives. Whitmore's persistence preserved the story, even though he never got recognition for it. Courage multiplies across time and consequence in ways we can rarely predict and never fully measure. If you found this story worth your time, if you learned something about World War II you didn't know before, consider this. There are hundreds of stories like this, maybe thousands. Moments where ordinary people did extraordinary things and then disappeared back into ordinary life. Innovations that changed warfare, but got credited to the wrong people or forgotten entirely. Acts of resistance so subtle they went unnoticed for decades. History isn't just the famous battles and celebrated generals. It's mechanics pulling shells from engines. It's prisoners carving names in brass. It's engineers writing reports nobody wants to read. It's all the small acts of courage and competence and care that add up to something bigger than any individual intended. The next time you hear about some crazy idea being dismissed by experts, remember Kowalski. The next time you think one person can't make a difference, remember the prisoners signing ammunition with microscopic letters. The next time you feel like giving up because nobody's listening, remember Whitmore spending 40 years trying to tell a story the world didn't want to hear. They all mattered. Their contributions all added up. And somewhere, someone survived because of what they did. From a mechanic with a pocket knife to a network of resistance that changed a war, from 7 words carved in brass to 11 names in letters too small to see, from one unexploded shell to 30,000 lives saved. That's the power of noticing what others miss, of refusing to accept obvious injustice, of doing what you can with what you have, even when success seems impossible. James Kowalski pulled a shell from an engine and asked questions. That simple act, that moment of curiosity and care, rippled through time in ways he never could have predicted. The shell is still there, silent monument to courage, known and unknown, visible and invisible, celebrated and forgotten. And the words are still legible, carved deep enough to last. Luck owes courage. It does. Always has. Always will. That's what wins wars. That's what changes history. That's what makes the difference between survival and extinction, between justice and atrocity, between remembering and forgetting. Not luck. Never just luck. Courage. Always courage. The courage to look closely, to question authority, to resist when resistance seems futile, to carve your name in brass, knowing nobody might ever read it. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's why this story, 8 decades later, still matters.